morning, and really sad to be here right before the lunch. It's a very tricky session to take, but then a very good morning and welcoming all of you to the Kerala Innovation Festival once again, and to be part of this panel, Her Turn, Power, Possibility, and Progress when a woman leads, right? I am Nikita. I'm the co-founder of a company called Superbrain AI. And I'm here to unpack the story of two lovely women entrepreneurs and they're probably the best reflection of the topic that we have today. And thank you, Anand sir, for setting such a lovely context to the She Leads panel. I was part of the Goldman Sachs 10K Women program, and I think you're absolutely the right person to, talk about it. Absolutely no doubt about it. So thank you for setting the context. So I want to probably welcome Shruti first. She's a seasoned entrepreneur, executive coach, and a leader at the intersection of technology, sales, and strategy. Shruti was the founder and CEO of Wingman, an AI-led sales platform that helped sales teams improve customer conversations in real time. Wingman was acquired by Clari, a sales tech unicorn, where she went on to lead international strategy and partnerships. Her career spans investment banking at Morgan Stanley, fintech at Payoneer, and a decade in tech commercialization and IP investing with Intellectual Ventures. She holds a PGDM from IIM Ahmedabad and a degree in life sciences from NUS. She's also a distinguished speaker and has delivered workshops and keynotes at leading institutions like IITs, IIMs, and SAS Bhumi. So I want all of us to welcome her onto this panel with a big round of applause.
Thanks, Nikita. Honor to be here and really excited. But yeah, eager to dive into the startup part of it.
Yeah. And here, also quickly to introduce Rubal. Rubal is the co-founder and CEO of Cuisance Lab, a deep tech, agri-tech company leveraging IoT and AI to transform quality assessment in fresh food supply chain. With over 13 years of experience spanning R&D leadership roles at companies like Havells and multiple deep tech ventures, she brings a rare blend of corporate insight and startup agility. Under her leadership, Cuisance has received accolades, including 2023 National Technology Award, Forbes Asia's 100 to Watch, and featured in Shark Tank. Anybody resonating with this face? Seen her on Shark Tank? No? And was a very controversial one as well. But yeah, a champion of data-driven innovation, Rubal is shaping the future of sustainable agri-supply chains through bold, tech-led solutions. So women, we are honored to have you both here. I think I'll right away dive into the first question, which is, Shruti, you started Wingman from a very personal pain point that you faced. That's what I understand during your work. So if you could just help us understand how is the journey from figuring out the pain point to leaving a very safe corporate job and taking the plunge to start something. How did that look like? How did you get the courage? And retrospectively looking back, is that something, it looks very gutsy, or was it something that naturally happened to you?
I think a mentor of mine once told me that the most addictive thing in life is really the salary that you get in your account every month. And I think it's very hard to actually leave the job and do something on your own. So I initially got so Wingman was in the space of recording sales calls in the business-to-business context and giving feedback to the salesperson on how they are doing or telling them what they should be saying next, etc. Now, and the reason why I wanted to just state this as I track through the journey is that, when you start something, you start with a certain idea, but then you also have to give it the space to evolve, right? So we started with saying, like, my personal pain point was, hey, I'm just sick and tired of speaking to my product team and like arranging customer feedback calls for them. And so if I could instead have all of these, calls between the salesperson and the customer being recorded, then, I don't have to go back and, arrange for these calls between the product team and the customer. And I could still get, the product team to build what I wanted or what the customer was telling us that was needed. And so that's kind of where we started, but of course it evolved, and we realized, the customer for the product, for our product, was going to be somebody different. It wasn't the product team, it was the sales team, and therefore we needed to build a product that was useful for the sales team. But just taking a step back, right, we got the idea for building this somewhere around like August of 2017, and I finally quit my job and started this formally in May of 2018. So it's just to say that, like, even when you first get the idea, it takes some time to validate it. And what I did was I went and spoke to 40 sales leaders. And I said, like, if I gave you this data, what will you do with it? And this was before we wrote a single line of code, before we, registered a company, before we did anything, right? And the idea was that, if people feel excited about it based on the feedback that they give, only then we are going to decide what we really want to build, right? There's no point in me saying that, hey, I've experienced this problem, now let's just go build it because I understand this well. So yeah, that was kind of our journey. Sometimes I would say that it was smart that we kind of took our time to validate, but it was also a little bit of fear of leaving that paycheck behind and saying like I want to jump full time.
So did you have co-founders by then, or were you sort of looking out for co-founders after you felt this pain point and you validated it?
So I think a lot of people talk about product market fit. I think enough people don't talk about founder market fit, right? And it's very important when you embark on a journey to also bring along co-founders with you who are helping you with either building the right product or with selling to the right market, right? So the founder market fit is something that investors keenly look for. But I think very often founders themselves don't think about it, right? And I think maybe it's different in different sectors. I won't say it's equally important. Like maybe in a business to consumer, like a B2C context, it's not maybe as important, unless of course, you're building with a particular technology in mind. But in a B2B context, it's super important. And I met my co-founders, I didn't know my co-founders before I started the company. I met them through a common friend. And they had actually moved back from the US to India with the intention of starting up. They were both engineers at Google in the Bay Area. And the idea was like, hey, we want to do something innovative. Google's already a large company. I'm not really seeing that excitement anymore. And so that was kind of how we got started. And I think the other piece of feedback would be to say like, hey, if you're thinking of starting up, sometimes it feels like there's a lot of hesitation because you don't have clarity. But try and have as many conversations with as many people, like increase that surface area of serendipity, because that's how you might find your next co-founder or you might find your investor. And the first thing to embrace as a startup founder, which I learned too late in life, was that your first job as a startup founder is really sales. You have to be telling that story, like Ganesh was saying earlier, right? Like you have to learn to tell that story, and you have to learn to articulate that to different stakeholders in a way that all of them relate to it.
Makes sense. I think we're all sort of mostly taught that look out for personal pain points and then figure out how to solve for them and then start something, right? I guess Ruble comes with a slightly different, evolution of starting the journey, right? Hers was more of, quit the job first and realizing early on that business is what you wanted to do, and then joining a program like EF, and then figuring out what to do, right? That requires a lot more courage, right? Because it's a lot of ambiguity in the beginning as to you don't even know what you're going to do. So I think I would love to hear from you on how did that journey look like, and probably if EF or Entrepreneur First as an accelerator program was not there, would you still have gone ahead and then, build something, or what was the value add that they created in that journey?
So EF is a program where 50 people from various backgrounds come and ideate. So I joined that program in 2019. But overall, my intention anyway was to start a company. Being first generation entrepreneur, nobody in my family has ever done business. I think that's the same for all of us here sitting. And it's quite challenging, but it's fascinating as well. We have read stories. In fact, I worked in couple of startups before starting the company. So it always excited me how technology can be used in something like where we are solving a big problem. So and food was something which was one of the key areas. Food wastage is something, one of the key areas where I wanted to utilize technology or IoT. That is my basic education or my skill set was in. So in EF, what we learned was to first understand our own strengths. So for example, for me, that is IoT or sensor design and hardware development. And I met my co-founder there who was a PhD in computational biology. So the first thing we learned was first identify your edge. It could be anything. It could be a technology. It could be how you process a problem statement, but understand that first and put your best foot forward for solving that problem. Second is then you identify a problem statement. So for us, that was we studied the market of food wastage, and this was more structured program. I think mostly passion driven people first identify, as you said, the problem first, and then they work on the how to solve it. For us it was more of identifying, first studying the market and what could be a problem statement with our edges we can apply that in. But I think what remains same for any entrepreneur is the drive to solve a large problem, uh, also having the freedom to solve it in a way where how you see that business growing. So in next 10 years, or what would be the potential outcome of the business. That is something for us also is very close to our heart, where we believe that data driven decision making can really decrease the food inefficiencies or food supply chain inefficiency, and that is what we are passionate about, and as a problem, overall problem, and using technology to solve it. If EF wasn't there or any such program wasn't there, I would have still quit my job. I would have still started up. But yeah, we would have taken much longer to learn. So EF gave us those frameworks to really work on how to ideate, how to have difficult conversations with your co-founder. In fact, we met in the program itself, so I found my co-founder also there. But yeah, having difficult I remember in the first month of the program itself, we were discussing things like, what if we don't have any cash, how would things work, like how much backup you have. So all permutation combinations of problem statements we discussed in the very early on. So those frameworks really helped to strengthen the framework of the company itself. Yeah.
Right. I mean, so the learning is, if you have a problem, good, validate it. If you don't have a problem as well, there is enough in the ecosystem that can help you sort of refine and put things together, put structure to your thoughts, and then help you figure out a problem that's close to your heart to solve for, I guess. I think, Shruti, what I want to ask next is about what did the first version of your product look like, an MVP, right? Especially probably starting up in a space where there are incumbents like Gong, which are like doing really, really great. How do you put out an MVP in front of customers and say that please trust this product, and then kind of try it out, and how's that journey like?
Yeah. So when we started up, we thought about like what is the simplest thing we could build. And of course, if you look at the product today versus what it was in the early days, it's completely different, right? Like the first version was literally trying to validate, how good is even the audio quality after the recording, and how good is the transcription quality, right? So once we decided like, hey, what is the technical part that we are trying to validate, and then there is also the behavior part of the user that you're trying to validate. We basically broke the product into those bare bones, right? So literally the first version was a simple phone app where we would just be like doing a call and saying like, okay, is it even transcribing? Can it even pick the keywords? Can I give it some advanced warnings on what am I looking for in the conversation? And can it highlight those things to me? But I think the biggest learning, and especially when you're building, and today I think in whatever space you're building, you'll always find that there's lots of competition, right? And like it's very hard to say like, hey, what is the unique thing that I bring to the table? The first thing I would say is, don't trust what you see on people's website and their case studies and the marketing claims that they're making, right? Because that's not what the product is actually doing. That's what the company wants you to believe that the product is doing, right? So our first big insight in that journey of deciding what to build came from actually speaking to customers of the products that were incumbents or that were our competitors, right? And when you go and speak to the customer, and like, this is a hilarious story. One day I told my co-founder, listen, we want to build a product. It's a language product. Transcription in India, in Indian languages, the AI is not that good. Let's just build it for the US, and that means that we have to go show up and talk to customers there. So literally, like from having that conversation to booking tickets and showing up in the US with no context, right? It was like 10 days. And we show up there, and I'm sitting in the office of head of sales of this large, and I won't name the company because I think I don't want to embarrass the people there, but like a very well-known Silicon Valley company. And I'm sitting in the head of the sales office, and I'm like, okay, so you tell me you use this product. What do you think of this, right? And this is the competitor's product. And he spends the next 30 minutes telling me how much he loves the product and everything. And then at the end of 30 minutes, I say, do you mind just logging into the product and showing me, how do you actually use it? And he's actually not even able to log in, right? Because he hasn't used the product. And that's when you begin to realize that what your customers want to believe about themselves and why they are talking about certain things the way they are talking about them is very different from the reality, right? And sometimes it's because it's the same thing, right? Like if somebody asks me the question like, hey, do you eat healthy? I'll always be like, oh yeah, I think I eat healthy. But if I go back and look at my data, the chances are that, like 7 out of 10 days, I've probably exceeded like, a bunch of my calorie or sugar metrics or whatever, right? So it's the same thing, right? Like your customer wants to believe that they are, great in their job, that they're great people, or that they're much more disciplined than they really are. And when they're giving you product feedback, they are going to give it based on the best version of themselves, right? And so that was kind of the insight of saying like, hey, you know what? Yes, on the website, the competitor is claiming that these are the benefits. The customer is telling me that these are the benefits. But they're really not getting the benefits. But they do care about the benefits. And so how do we build a product that delivers that true value to them? Or is there a different promise, right? And the second insight really is when you're building, especially for businesses, you have to be able to answer the question, how does the person who buys my product either gets more salary or gets a promotion because they bought my product, right? If you can make that linkage clear to them on how can I help this person be successful, your product will be successful, right? So it's very important to use that as a vision when you're developing your own product, not in some sort of a like, can I give them something under the table, right? But more in terms of how do I make them successful at their job, and how can I really make sure that they understand that this product is going to get them their next promotion.
Got it. So no amount of AI will substitute for, going and actually sitting in the office and talking to people and figuring out what you really need to build, right? I mean, great insight. I think to Rubal, I want to ask a very similar question, more from a hardware, deep tech standpoint. Most of us probably have an impression that even if we want to build something in the deep tech space with a hardware component to it, you need a lot of capital, and that's the only way to sort of start off. So what did your MVP look like, and was it without capital, with less capital, and how did that help you probably get your first customer?
Yeah, so I think hardware requires capital, that's the truth. And it requires more capital than a software business because it's a tangible thing. You need components, you need to build the whole thing before demonstrating it. And that's the good part also, because it's not very easily replicable compared to a software. So you have a more tangible IP. But for what our first prototype looked like was a sensor connected to computer and just reading sensor data, and that is what we developed during EF program itself. The money from EF really helped us. So I think the role of early stage pre-seed funds are really helpful. I think government is also now coming up with a lot of grants for such MVPs, which are really required for hardware. Anything R&D happening in hardware will be totally driven by the grants that you get for pre-seed. Like before you have built a product, you need some funds to develop a MVP. It can be as low as 20-30 lakhs, but those are required to develop something, demonstrate, do pilots, and then you go to the next level. for us, EF as well as SOSV. SOSV is also one of our early stage investors, pre-seed, and we got support from them via the Hacks accelerator. It's a hardware accelerator. We developed our first prototype in Shenzhen in China, and as a part of the accelerator, we were in China for 3 months, and we developed the MVP there. It took around 6 to 8 months to develop the first prototype. Then we went for the pilots. We were anyway discussing with customers on what is the requirement and how it will be implemented. So that feedback was constantly coming in, but we wanted to test it. So it requires a lot of iterations, and I think we did the current solution is like more than like 20 iterations we have done in terms of the sensors itself, and it requires capital.
And how long did that take, the initial MVP to come out?
So it took around 6 to 8 months to develop a first MVP, but yeah, first pilot started in like after a year. So 1 year of iterations and MVP and testing, and then and because our product is not just hardware, we have to build a model of data and the model for testing the fruits or meat. So that model also requires some data. So that also took some time, couple of months, and then we released the first version. Yeah, it took a year.
Got it. So while the model is being built, do you also start putting out, content on your website and talking to customers saying that this is what you're building and gauging interest? Is that something that happens parallelly, or do you still wait for the product, at least the MVP, to come out?
No, actually, we started talking to the customers from day one. That's what we learned in EF, that even before registering the company, we were, and like the funny part was that both of us were not a domain expert. Like I am from IoT background, Shrishti is a PhD. So none of us knew anyone in the food industry. So we was totally via LinkedIn and writing emails, figuring out what would be the email ID of the CEO of the company, or the maybe who would be the who's who of the company, and writing to them, meeting them, trying to get a. But the good thing was, because this is a need, how we got to know, how we validated the need was because we were getting those we were getting those meeting with the key people in food supply chain, and we got to know that this is actually a real problem statement. So we were in touch from day one in EF with the clients, and that's how we also zeroed down on what kind of sensor, what kind of product will be developed. So the feedback was constantly coming in. Yeah,
makes sense. I think coming to you, Shruti, YC is like the most, fanciest place for most entrepreneurs in India, for sure, different parts of the world as well. So would love to hear what was your experience being part of YC, and how did that change the trajectory of the company, in what ways? And would you still recommend people to do it, or is there a stage at which a company has to typically be benefited once you join YC?
Yeah, I think, I know this is part of the She Leads Summit, so I must say that, my first reaction to actually even finding out that we had gotten selected by Y Combinator was, it wasn't joy and happiness, it was the trepidation on like, how am I going to just leave everything? And I had like a 2-year-old son. At that point, he was 2. And like go and stay in the Bay Area for 3 months. Like this is, just ridiculous. I don't think I'm going to do this, right? But of course, you develop your support systems, and, I went ahead with it, and I spent 3 months in the Bay Area. Wow. But I think on the Y Combinator piece itself, so I would say if you're building for the US market, right? And whatever market you're building for, there's a lot of value in being very close to your market. And I would say that was the biggest value that we got from Y Combinator. Because that became the forcing function for us to go and spend 3 months there. Like I said, otherwise there was no way I was going to just drop everything and go and spend 3 months there. And being there, it's not just about like being able to talk to your customers ad hoc, etc. But there's also a lot of value in understanding the cultural, the backdrop of how people work, etc. So that when people are using your product, what is the context? What is their mindset that they're coming with? And those things I think are very hard to really gather when you go in for like 3 days and come back for, and spend like half the time of that being jet lagged. So that was a big value, right? The second, of course, there's a big dream for a lot of people to be like, oh, I want to be able to meet the large venture capital companies. And that's, I think both exciting but overwhelming as well, right? Like being on that fancy Sandhill Road with the fancy offices where like the artwork probably costs more than the money that I'm ever raising for my company, right? So I think like it's both exciting and humbling and scary at the same time. But I think what it gives you is one confidence in yourself that listen, if I made it here, then at least somebody believes that I should be here, right? So. So before you start believing in yourself, sometimes I think it's helpful for the ecosystem to believe in you, like you said, right? Like being part of the Entrepreneur First or being part of an incubator. And I think it just goes back to being part of a community, because then you have people you can ask the same questions to, like what Ganesh was saying earlier, right? Like, hey, I need an office space, or I'm hiring somebody and I have no idea how to hire for this role. Of course, there is lots of community today in India for startups. And I think depending on wherever you are building for, it's important to go and spend time with that community. Like I'm very active with the SaaS Boomi community, which is something for software and AI companies. And like, those are the things that give you the ability to short circuit your mistakes, right? So it's like instead of hiring the wrong person and then realizing 12 months later that I've hired the wrong person, if I can actually get 3 other people to interview the person, because I don't know anything about marketing and I have no ability to interview the head of marketing, right? Then that's going to really help your journey. So I think it's just many small things that play a part in the entrepreneur's journey, and they come from different sources. Y Combinator, of course, gives you a lot of that support, but also the brand is great. So,
So a follow-up question on that itself is, you mentioned how YC really helped you sort of kickstart your US market, right? For folks, I mean, I've actually heard 2 schools of thoughts. One set who says that if you want to build for the US market, from day one, focus on US market, be there, build for them. You're wasting time in India. And then the other school of thought is more like, start here, test your product here, get feedback, and then, slowly, eventually figure out a way to move there. I mean, is there a right answer to this? And especially when probably platforms like YC are not available for a lot of folks, what would be a better approach, or is it very specific to the solution that you're building?
Do you want the real answer?
Yeah.
Well,
What stays in, what you say in this room stays in this room, so don't worry.
So I think my answer really is that you have to be talking to the market that you're building for from day one, because each market is so different, right? So it's not wrong to say that, hey, I'm building this for the India market and therefore I'm going to, get my first 10 customers here. But if your vision is to say like, hey, this product makes sense for the US market, but listen, I don't have 10 people that I can sell this product to today. So I'm going to speak to 10 people in India that I can sell this product to. That's just not going to get you anywhere, right? It's actually going to set you back by 3 years, because what will happen is you'll build a product and then you will get so entangled in servicing the customers that you have, in listening to their complaints every day, that you'll find it very hard to go and focus on a new market and build a product that that market needs. And just think of one reason why a product is different for India and the US, right? The cost of labor in India versus the US is so different that the way a company in India thinks about efficiency gains from software, and I'm just talking about like what I know, right, which is building software products for a business-to-business context, right? Because the cost of labor is so different, right? The way I think of efficiency gains here versus in the US is completely different, right? Take an example of my product, right? It was meant for salespeople trying to do high-value sales. Now, when I went and I made that mistake, right? I went and spoke to a bunch of companies in India. The fact of the matter is that a salesperson in India gets paid somewhere between 30 to 50,000 rupees a month, right? And which is fair salary or whatever. But the fact is that when I go and try to sell them a product that is going to cost 5,000 rupees a month, they are going to say like, hey, how does this compare to the salary of the person, right? What if I just go hire one more person and let these other 10 people be inefficient, right? Does it even make sense for me to get a product that improves the efficiency by 10%, right? Whereas in the US, if they're paying $60,000 a year to that salesperson, the way they will look at that productivity gain is going to be different. So what they're going to ask from your product, how they're going to value your product is going to look different. So, I think both markets are fine. You just have to decide which market you're building for, which market that product makes sense for. And then from day one, you have to do whatever you can to talk to only those customers. Anybody who's not paying you money is not your customer, and don't take feedback from them.
Wow, that's great. I think, Rubal, to you also a similar question, which is from a hardware perspective, is the common norm is that India as a market is not ready to pay enough for software. So is it very similar in the hardware space as well? And I mean, what are the ways in which you are trying to expand outside of India, if that's the case?
Yeah, I think it's a similar story for hardware. The only thing is, the only difference would be that in software, the adoption is much easier when you're scaling out. Like, it's easier to deploy outside India. In hardware, geography, like being in the geography helps. And for us also, how it happened was, first we were just like trying to do pilots in Bangalore itself, because like for deployment, even for pilots, one person has to go there and we need to evaluate, especially when the technology is developing. Your team has to be there, and it's difficult to do those things remotely. But overall, as a market, I think hardware, the benefit is that you can reduce labor cost, you can reduce a lot of factors which can add up to how much you can charge. That thing is definitely there. But if you compare it to how much like anybody outside India from a developed economy would pay, would be much better in terms of margins. It's how you can price it, and what scale you can sell. So I think those are very similar to how it is for the software. The only thing is that, yeah, in India, B2B hardware is still a better sweet spot for a early stage startup compared to a B2C. If you are going to a B2C, then it's a very challenging space in terms of the marketing cost and those things. So the costs of development is comparatively lower for a B2B hardware startup in India.
But anyways, if you're putting X amount of effort and you can get the, much higher margins elsewhere, would that be an obvious choice for you to? But like you said, the constraints are to be able to physically be present in that location.
So our approach is to first like target the Southeast Asian markets or Middle Eastern markets, and some inbound requests are like also coming in, which is great because then it's easier for us also to have a base there and building trust. So it's very difficult. Software can sell remotely as well.
Yeah.
For hardware, you have to be in that geography to sell.
Makes sense. I think, Shruti, I want to probably ask you about the acquisition that happened. I mean, that's, again, another dream for most founders, I guess. What I want to understand is, it's a very personal decision, of course, amongst the founders. But what were the major factors that led you to, choose this path? And what I always have doubt is in terms of, is an acquisition ever in your, is it ever a goal when you sort of drive your product roadmaps and, put strategy together? Do you work for getting acquired ever? Is that ever a thought?
Sure. So I'll keep this short. I think the thing with acquisitions really is that you have to think of it in the context of what is my vision for having this particular product out in the hands of as many people as it can be, right? And how that finds its path, whether it is through raising more funds or whether it is through getting acquired or whether it is through doing partnerships, they all should tie into one cohesive strategy, right? So acquisition is more in, so in our case, the way we thought about the acquisition journey was, hey, the way the space was evolving, what we realized was that, and today I think a lot of people in the room would have experienced a Zoom call or a Google Meet call where there is, some sort of a bot that's recording the meeting, right? So what we were beginning to see back in 2022 coming out of the pandemic was that, the product that we were building was something that a lot of larger companies wanted as part of, the set of features that they were offering. So we had two choices. Either we needed to become a platform which was offering multiple things, and this was one of the features, or we needed to become part of a platform where this was, the feature or the specialization that we were bringing. And the way we thought about it was that, the stage at which we were to go from there to becoming a platform was a long journey. But it seemed like an opportune time to become part of a platform because there were so many platforms that wanted that feature. So I think it's important as a founder to kind of keep that context and perspective to know like, hey, yes, this is my baby, but I'm willing, the journey is really to try and see if I can get this value into the hands of as many people and not get too attached or too egotistical about like, hey, I think I'm the only one who can build this in this particular way.
Thank you so much, Shruti and Rubal, for taking time out. Shruti is coming from Dubai and Rubal is from Bangalore. So thank you for the kind gesture, coming down here, meeting folks here. And who better to talk about her turn than you guys? So I think companies make more profit when they have women, like you said. So it's not just a good thing to do. It's just the more logical and, way to do stuff. So here's to many more her turns. So wishing you all the best in the upcoming journey. And thank you all folks for being good listeners. Thank you.